Well,
You know,
hello, everybody. Welcome to the Sioka Center's Lunch and Learn series, part of the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America. My name is Luke Burgis. I'm the Director of Programs at the Sioka Center, and this is our fourth Lunch and Learn series of this semester. Today, we have a very special guest, my colleague, Brandon Vaidyanathan, and I will introduce him shortly. Just to say a couple of words about what this is, if this is your first time joining us, this is really meant to be a way for us to explore on a monthly basis topics that are of interest to faith-filled professionals, people that are interested in principled entrepreneurship and in business as a calling. So we've been doing these now for a couple of years and plan to be continuing the series into the next semester. So we'll have another one of these in January, and we'll announce that as soon as we have a guest and a date lined up. So let's start with a prayer before we get started. And this is it's the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe. So this is the prayer that John Paul II prayed when he visited Mexico City in 1979. So in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Our Lady of Guadalupe, teacher of hidden and silent sacrifice, to you who come to meet us sinners, we dedicate on this day all of our being and all of our love. We also dedicate to you our life, our work, our joys, our infirmities, and our sorrows. Grant peace, justice, and prosperity to all peoples, for we entrust to your care all that we have and all that we are, Our Lady and our Mother. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. The format of these lunch and learns, we really want to make these as interactive as possible. So our guest today and I'll be your host, and we'll just kick things off with a brief discussion. And then we're going to open it up at the absolute latest at 1:30, if not earlier. But in the meantime, please put any questions that you have in the chat. I'll ask you to share your question aloud anyway, but so you can just say I have a question, and I'll invite you to ask it at some point. But please do share any thoughts, any ideas, any questions for Brandon or for me or for one another. We do want to try to make this into a community as much as possible, and we should be. Right now, it's the monthly Zoom meetings, but eventually we hope to have and offer other opportunities for engagement as well. So our guest today, Brandon Vaidyanathan, is my colleague. He's associate professor here at the Catholic University of America, chair of the Department of Sociology. He's become a very good friend, has been the principal investigator of many international studies, very interesting and important international studies, most recently exploring the relationship between beauty and science. And he is also the founder of the Beauty at Work project, which is why he's with us today to talk about the theme of beauty at work. So welcome, Brandon. Thanks for being with us.
Hey, pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Brandon, maybe the best place to get started, I think, might be by way of background. Why did you become interested in this topic of beauty at work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about it every day. I wonder if I should keep doing this, but it started really with my my interest in the concept of beauty as it relates to justice, which sounds maybe strange, but I was maybe 15 years ago taking a course in grad school on social movements, and it was protest movements, and we were looking at how moral outrage seems to be the sort of emotional fuel that drives protests. And it struck me that there's got to be a corollary to that underlying perception of moral violation. There has to be a good that people are yearning for, but that never is articulated. And I was doing some reading, and I came across passages in Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Dorothy Day on beauty and how beauty mattered in their sense of justice. And so that connection became really important to me. And then a few years later, I was talking to scientists. I was doing a big international research project looking at what scientists think about religion. And we interviewed some 600 something scientists in 8 countries. And in talking to them about their work, we found a lot of them said they made a lot of sacrifices. They'd given up a well-paying job for the sake of a lesser paying job in academia. They sacrificed their health and sometimes their families. And we'd ask them, well, why did you do it? What makes it worthwhile for you? And many of them would say, because it's beautiful. And I found that really striking. Like, why would they use the word beauty? And I didn't have any sense of what beauty meant to scientists. And so I decided I wanted to investigate what this term means. And it turns out they talk a lot about beauty. And so I spent the last few years talking to scientists in a number of countries. And as I talked to scientists, I started to wonder, I wonder if this sort of thing matters elsewhere outside of science. And so when we think of beauty, we think of art or fashion or architecture, but what about a restaurateur, right? Like a cocktail bar owner or a chef or a lawyer even. Like, did they find beauty in the work they do? So I got really interested in that, and it was actually an experience I had when I was on retreat at the Franciscan Monastery of the Holy Land just a year ago, which is in Washington, D.C., and a really beautiful place. And I met this guy there who was the groundskeeper, and he used to work in IT. He was like a global technology professional. He had, worked in India and worked in many countries. And he was now the sort of CEO of the Garden Guild. So he spends all his time tending the gardens, and they grow produce, fresh produce that they give away to people in food deserts in DC. But it's not just any kind of produce. This is award-winning stuff. And they've been winning an exponential number of awards. Year on year, they go to these, farming festivals and so on, and they win all these ribbons. And that food, I can't buy it. Like, it's really beautiful, but it's only accessible to people in food deserts. And I thought that was an extraordinarily beautiful thing. And I wanted to tell his story, and I wanted to tell other stories like his. And so that's kind of how I got into this project of trying to explore what beauty means in sort of unconventional domains of work.
So you've got the project exploring the role of beauty in science, but then there's this whole narrative-driven storytelling part of the process as well. And it sounds like you've been interviewing a lot of people this past year, trying to find these stories. Is there anything from the Science and Beauty project, like any of those key findings, maybe you could share a couple, that you think might be related in some way to beauty at work?
Yeah, we find three types of beauty in science, the way at least we're categorizing it. The first is what we'd call sensory beauty or simple beauty, and that's the beauty of the stars, beauty of cells, the kind of thing you would, beauty in nature, but even beauty in maybe your devices. You build sort of a really intricate device, and it's extraordinarily elegant and can do great things, and you're filled with a sense of marvel. So that's one kind of beauty, which is a lot to do with sense experience. And when we think of beauty, we usually think of that kind of beauty. And I think people experience that in various domains of work. So you can experience beauty in sort of if you have a job that involves engaging with nature, that's amazing. Then you can actually see that. Or if you're a teacher and you deal with children, and when they're not vomiting or fighting, you might be able to see some beauty in their eyes or something, right? So there's various ways in which you can encounter beauty on a natural level. And we often don't pay attention to those things, and we have to learn to attend to that. The second kind of beauty is what we call useful beauty, and that is beauty as a guide to truth. And so this is rather particular to fields like theoretical physics, feels like closer to mathematics, and they argue that if your equations are really beautiful, then they must be true. There's this hunch that beauty is somehow a guide. Turns out it's not a reliable guide. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And so the criteria that people use, sometimes you found in the early half of the 20th century, a lot of physicists were really sure that the kind of mathematics they were using, the really intuitions about beautiful mathematics, turned out to be true quite often. And then after the 1960s or so, it stopped working. And people now are complaining that we're being misled by a bad aesthetic. Maybe like how, hundreds of years ago, astronomers used to think that the orbits of the planets had to be spheres because the sphere is the most perfect shape. And then after a while, that kind of stops working, and you got to do all kinds of contortions in order to make the orbits fit this spherical model, because the reality is it's an ellipse. And unless you change your aesthetic, you're going to be misled, right? So I think there's some ways in which beauty can be misleading to us. I think our intuitions about what's beautiful, maybe in our expertise that we build up, for a while, we might start to say, this is a really great investment, or this is a really great product. but maybe that sort of intuition runs out after a while because the world is changing and the context you're in is changing. If you're stuck in a particular aesthetic, you could end up being misled. And the final kind of beauty is the beauty of understanding. And so that is glimpsing behind the sort of patterns and appearances, a sense of how things really work, the inner logic of things or the hidden order behind things. And you go, this is how things are. I've talked to poets who've used that exact expression that some Nobel Prize winners we've interviewed have said. Like I talked to a poet who told me, and I asked him, what is a beautiful poem? And he says, it's something where I read it and I go, that's how things are. That, it reveals to you how the world works in a way that's not unlike what scientists find in, an experiment that discloses to them something true about how reality works. So that is a deeper experience, I think, of beauty, of a surprising insight into the way reality is. Again, you could be mistaken, right? You could get an insight that turns out to be wrong much later. But it's the kind of pleasure that I think for a lot of people, at least in science, is really worth fighting for. It's worth struggling for, and I think that's probably applicable to a lot of other fields of work as well.
Mm. So you and I, the Sioka Center, and you with Archbridge co-hosted a dinner in October. We brought together roughly 12 people around a table in Georgetown here in DC, and we talked about beauty at work. And it was quite moving in unexpected ways. And it was just so interesting to me to hear some of the stories that people shared. It was really a storytelling exercise. I believe you asked them to share two things. One was an experience of beauty from their childhoods, and the other was an experience of beauty at work. I was particularly struck by how many people shared stories of food.
Yes.
But I'm just wondering if you had any key takeaways from that dinner. Anything that surprised you, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean that was such a great experience, and I've replicated that on a couple more occasions. One in Cambridge in the UK with a very different group of people, and another one in DC with students, just to see what happens when you bring different people together. And I the two prompts really struck, because I'm really interested, as we're talking about beauty at work and what it means in the sort of actual work we're doing. But I thought to start with childhood because there's something about origins and beginnings, I think that can really give us a glimpse at, or perhaps prime us to thinking about beauty in a way that's generative. I was struck by first of all how quickly people connected with each other. I mean, and this has happened again in all the places I've done this. Small talk is painful for a lot of people, and when you have a dinner and people are sitting and chit-chatting, sometimes you can have a great conversation, but you don't know, right? And you typically don't have a memorable experience anyway. So these events turned out to be memorable for a lot of the participants, and I've been getting letters, since even since our DC event in October. So I think it's got this transformative potential to connect and bond around beauty. A couple of things that struck me were the experience of beauty in childhood. A lot of them tended to be about moral beauty, and so that is an exemplary person, say a mother or a grandmother. So typically, like, grandparents would come up. I think we had a few examples of grandparents in our conversation, of them being extraordinarily virtuous people, or people who were people of hospitality, and they created a sort of space that you wanted to be in. I think you talked about your grandmother's studio and the kind of ordered chaos that environment had created, and how that's remained a thread, right, for you as well, and shaping in some way your imagination, but also a sense of where you feel at home or where you might thrive. So I think that thread is really important to think about, and I invite our listeners, our viewers, to do this too, and think about, the first thing that comes to mind when you think of a beautiful moment from your childhood. And if there's a person or a place involved, I suspect that might connect in some way to something that's really important to you today, and to what you're called to, and what's really important in the work you're doing. In the examples of work that people gave, beauty at work and in their more contemporary lives, there were a lot of examples of integration, of things where they felt like they were being put together, where they were feeling a sense of wholeness, or a sense of rootedness, even a sense that here's something that is happening through me rather than something that is done by me. So there's sort of a sense of what is effortless, what comes naturally, and those are moments that people find beautiful in their work, as moments where they're able to experience perhaps a sense of flow or a sense that this is who I am, or see that in others. So if you're working, with clients, and you can see something integrating for them, coming together for them, maybe their sense of identity sort of converging. That is equally beautiful. And again, I think for me that ties into this third kind of beauty of understanding, that you get a glimpse into, this is how things are, and this is what I'm made for, and I'm in the right place, right? So those were
Mm,
the two things that really stood out.
mm. Yeah, thanks, Brandon. I'd encourage our listeners here to think about both of those questions: an experience of beauty in childhood, and then some experience of beauty in work. What's the first thing that comes to mind? It struck me, Brandon, during that dinner that um, many people there was a thread that ran through that story of beauty in childhood to perhaps their current profession. So for me, it was, my grandmother's art studio and other things that I didn't share. It was experiences of great books or writing or artistic things, creative outlets that were the things that were beautiful to me as a child. And then at a certain point, I got into various lines of work and starting companies that didn't give me that creative expression that I really yearned for. And then I sort of realized that there was beauty missing. So it made me wonder if there's some connection between um, beauty and our vocation, beauty and our calling, and why certain people find different things beautiful. And I remember at that dinner there was one gentleman who is currently basically a rocket scientist, whose experience of beauty as a child was how beautiful it was that the cars in a giant parking lot could all there was like emergent order, and they all found their proper space. There's kind of a very mathematical thing that he found beautiful. I'd love to have known what was going inside of his mind as a kid when he saw that. But it struck me that there was some thread. He went into science. So what do you, I mean, do you think that there is some connection between beauty and vocation in terms of how one perceives beauty?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, vocation is a complicated thing, right? Because it may not necessarily mean the tasks you're doing in your job. I mean, there may be
Mm,
things that we're called. We have vocation to be fathers and mothers, and there are other aspects of our vocations. I think that that they're probably linked to beauty as well. But I think beauty is at its basic level attraction, right? It's that which pulls us out of ourselves, and I think it's a really important clue. I don't know if you can experience a sense of calling without experiencing that calling as beautiful. I suppose you could experience it as threatening as well. If people feel that they're called to, I don't know, religious life or something initially, that might be frightening, or even to being a mother or father, and that could be in some ways scary, but there's that attractiveness, right? And I think it's important for us to not because what are the other kinds of ways in which we could make our choices, or we could say, well, logically, one ought to do this, or this is what we've always done, or there are other kinds of registers of evaluation that we might use in making decisions about what to pursue, and I think we discount this sort of attraction, right? So, and I don't mean just sort of an impulsive attraction, but sort of a deeper, more sustained kind of, what is this thing that's really been striking for me, that's sort of been pulling me out of myself, that makes me sort of forget myself. I think that's an important clue. And sometimes it may not be really clear. Okay, look, here's my job right now. Here's my situation in life, and yet I'm called to I'm really attracted to this sort of thing. I don't really know how to make those things fit together. That may just be the situation for someone at this moment, but that doesn't mean you discount it. I think it's really crucial. Pay attention to that and see what that's saying to you. So yeah, I think sometimes it could be clear cut, but sometimes one might have to still, sort of wrestle with it and try to sort of really nurture that sense of what they're drawn to, and see where that takes you.
mm. Is there a have you thought much or explored when one feels a lack of beauty? I mean, I'm
Mhm.
imagining a person who's, you know, perhaps goes to a job every day where they really struggle to find any beauty there. They're in
Yeah.
an office, doing they might feel like they're doing relatively mundane work, And if you ask them, well, what do you find beautiful about your job? They might struggle to find something beautiful about that. What would you say to that person? Or I mean, is this a matter of being attentive? Um, what kind of signal is that if somebody
Yeah.
is struggling to find beauty in their work?
Yeah, there could be a lot of reasons. We did talk to some scientists who said that to us, and we'd ask them, where do you experience beauty in your work? And some of them would say, I don't really think I experience any beauty in the work I do, and it could be for a number of reasons. And the strangest example was a guy who had, I mean, he sort of really felt, talking to him, you felt like really miserable for him because he just really was so unhappy. And then we noticed there was a stack of law books on a shelf behind him, and my colleague who was doing the interview asked him, what's with those books? It's like, oh, I'm thinking of becoming a lawyer because I'm tired of this job. Yeah, I really don't experience any beauty as a scientist, so I may as well go do something else. Um, but it could also just be that you're in an environment that, in a context that is really pressurizing, or the relationships that maybe you really enjoy the science, but you're expected to also teach X number of courses, and do all these other administrative tasks, and fill in all these reports, and so there are a whole bunch of other things that are part of this job that are extraneous to the core thing that's calling you to it, or the heart of it. It's quite normal in science for a lot of people, increasingly, unless you're at the very top universities. It's very difficult. There's this sort of sociologists call it role strain. There's a tension between what you are expected to do and the conditions at work, that are given to you, that actually don't allow you to do the thing that you're supposed to be doing. So if you're told, you're supposed to be doing science and doing experiments and generating some knowledge, but you're given all kinds of other stuff to do that get in the way. You do very little science. It's very hard for you to flourish in that environment, and so that's a challenge that a lot of people face, and I think it's incumbent on leaders to try to create the conditions for people to be able to do what they're supposed to be doing. This seems very basic, but in a lot of organizations that doesn't happen. And so that's a challenge, and sometimes that's a clue that maybe you need to be looking elsewhere, or try to figure out ways to work with the leadership of your organization to say, hey, look, I mean, this is what I'm supposed to be doing, and I'm not really, and then, not only is it what I'm supposed to be doing, but that's where I thrive. That's why I got into this job in the first place. But what about all these other things? How do I, to what extent do I need to keep doing that? And women, we find a lot of women get burnt out because it's the burden of like a lot of service falls on them sort of by default. They end up taking up a lot of the slack for being on committees, and for responding to students' emotional needs, et cetera, et cetera. And there are things that they end up doing that leave them very little time for their research, and then their productivity suffers. And that's a real challenge. So and I think it's not just in science. I think in all kinds of fields you find the emotional, relational burden is taken on disproportionately by women. And so that's another area of this sort of mismatch between what is calling somebody to a job, and then what their job actually ends up looking like. And so job design, I think, is a really crucial thing to work on here. But I think people can also learn to be more attentive to, people are also driven by other kinds of, ambitions, and, maybe you're just writing this journal article because you want a lot of publications. And if you do that, if you're doing things just for extrinsic reward, or Luke, as you say, thin desires, I think you can burn out. I think unless we're attentive to sort of the thicker desires, and really the vocational aspect of what we're doing, emotionally, I don't know if we can sustain it for a lot of us.
Mm, mm. I mean, the word sustain is interesting because you made me realize that, there are often things that I have to do in life that I don't find beautiful.
Mhm. Yeah.
Right. And I can't sort of go through life and go through my job sort of expecting, to be awash in beauty all of the time. Right. And humans tend to become sometimes numb to beautiful things, right? That's something that perhaps attracted us to something in the first place. Our relationship to it changes as we become more familiar with it, and perhaps we don't find it as beautiful as we once did. I remember when I was a seminarian in Rome, how guilty I felt when one day I walked by the piazza and St. Peter's, and I didn't even look at it, and I sort of walked back up the hill to the seminary, and I thought to myself, wow, like, the first time that I saw that, I was awestruck, and now it's not affecting me in quite the same way. So, just curious as to how time, right,
Yeah.
also changes the perception of beauty. Is that something that you've heard from anybody else?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, we do
Yeah.
take things for granted, and people certainly do change in their what they find beautiful, and yeah, things that I think even as you're starting out in science, things that you initially found really theory, or something that you find absolutely um groundbreaking. After a while, you start to take it for granted because it's a basic assumption in what you're doing, and those insights initially that moved you uh start to feel trivial, unless you're able to see the excitement in others. So teaching sometimes
Mm,
helps.
mm,
Some people talk about teaching as though it's a burden, but teaching is a way to regenerate, for scientists and other academics, a way to regenerate this appreciation of beauty. And we shouldn't denigrate it for that reason, because you can see those light bulbs going off in other people's heads, and you realize, this insight that I experienced in the past is still a universal insight that someone else today can experience, and
mm,
it renews its value. But if you don't have that opportunity, then I think it's very easy to take it for granted.
absolutely. Well, I'd love to open up the floor at this point. I had a schedule before 1:30. I see, Tim responded in the chat. This is so insightful. I plan on using ideas for this when our family gets together this upcoming Christmas season. Tim, did you any more comment or color on that?
It was just a general comment. I'm going to use the questions and ideas just to get my adult kids thinking a little bit more about the beauty.
Mm. Yeah, the questions were really they really, at least the experience that I had at dinner, I think Brandon mentioned, they really somehow facilitated. Most of us were strangers, and I only knew a couple of people in the room, and it somehow cut through the small talk and allowed a level of bonding to happen that's hard to imagine would have happened without being able to share experiences that were so personal. So I think you'll find it a helpful exercise, Tim.
Yeah, Tim, I would recommend you give them the prompt, a day or two ahead, so they can think it over. Particularly the one about childhood. I think that's just so generative in terms of you really learn surprising things about people you think you know well.
I like that, Brandon, because the fact that they are adults, so they have to ponder back. That's good.
Father Bob, you had a question?
Yes, I hope that the audio is working here. I'd like to ask. I guess it's the main question here. It has to do with that I have in mind with stories, and what some call the narrative structure of human action. Sense that each of us is living a story, and this is in the area of aesthetics, and also in literature, and also in ethics. There's the debate about having to do with the beauty of a story and whether or not the beauty of the story is proportionate to the moral character of the protagonist. And oftentimes it seems to be the opposite, that there can be powerful and beautiful stories that have anti-heroes that are displaying a morally wicked life. But the reason why I think this is very much related to the subject is, if it is true that we're telling a story and that our stories that we are telling entails striving, is there a sense that there is beauty in the very striving of the telling of the story, aside from the achievement of the result? Because throughout this whole consideration, there might be a kind of a tension between the living moment and the outcome. Sometimes we're seeking an outcome and we bank on our happiness depending upon the outcome, and that leads to frustration. Whereas if we seek a value intrinsic to the activity itself, and this could, Brandon, you mentioned the experience of flow, and this is one of the characteristics of flow, what Martin Seligman calls the autotelic personality, where in the very doing of the action, one finds meaning and therefore beauty in that action. So I'm really meant to be, this is really a question that's meant to be an exploration as to also what you said about the grandparents who have given a, a great moral example that is beautiful. I think that a feature of that beauty is the striving in their life, at times against odds, and where there's suffering that is intrinsic to that beauty, where it's and some I guess analysts of stories and their structures and their moral life speak of how there can be tragic components that nonetheless lead towards a comedic or fulfilling, a happy, a releasing ending. And all of this, as Christians, we hope for in our life, that we overcome sin, and in view of the resurrection, in view of our own resurrections, in view of paradise. And so perhaps even if we're not in nature, even if we're doing some kind of work, that it could be cleaning our restrooms, maybe there's a beauty in that, which is in that striving and in the living of a story, that on the whole is that there's a becoming, and becoming one, and becoming that is for the sake of others. There's also a gift and done for love. Those are just some ramblings that I wonder if both Brandon and Luke, what your reactions might be. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Father Bob. That resonates a lot with a number of themes that came up. I mean, certainly there's different examples of striving that come up. I mean, certainly the case of immigrant grandparents who really had to struggle a lot. I mean, that was one kind of story that came up. Of that's part of the moral exemplarity of those particular individuals. For the person who was recounting the story, was the hardships they went through, and how they were not transformed in a negative way by those hardships, but right, they were somehow they became people that this person still looks up to, and part of the suffering is part of what contributes to their beauty. There's also striving in the sense of just simply learning how to master a task, right? And I think that one of our guests talked about just her vivid memory of beauty from childhood had to do with swimming, and long distance swimming, and had to do with a sense of rhythm and so on that she would encounter there, but also just sort of striving continually to do this. And I think even some of the examples of beauty in people's professional lives had to do with craftsmanship, really creating something excellent, for its own sake, that intrinsic reward for a job well done. That you're judging, the correspondence between what you're doing and an objective standard, regardless of what someone else says. But there are some times where the outcome does really seem to matter. And so, I mean, if you are trying to solve a problem for your client and the process isn't working, you may think it's a really great, matrix that you have developed that's perfectly symmetrical or whatever. If you're a McKinsey consultant, if you're not solving the problem, it's not really beautiful. So there is a sense in which those outcomes they hold you accountable in some way, right? So the beauty has to be in service of something greater, and needs to be changed if that outcome isn't working, I suppose. I think, anyway, those are a few things that came up in response to what you were saying. But I think we are storytelling creatures fundamentally. I think we really do need stories. Actually, when we talk to chefs and cocktail bar owners and so on, it's one of the ingredients of like a really beautiful meal or a good cocktail is a good story for the people who are engaged in those crafts.
Thank you.
Jack, you have a question or comment and a quote from Queen Victoria.
I'm with Tim on trying to understand an adult daughter. She's an artsy kind of person, and the firstborn, and she's a wedding photographer and an art director at a major publication. And so we're trying to understand, and we came across this quote. Charmaine and I, my wife, did, and it kind of talks to Hannah, my firstborn. She said, and Queen Victoria said, "Beware of artists; they mix with all classes of society, and therefore are the most dangerous." Brandon, Luke, could you care to comment on this? Is it real, or is it funny, or it could go either way?
I don't know what to make of that quotation.
I don't either. It's because it just doesn't sound like her, and I just yeah, yeah, just trying to understand the artistic mind of which I have, you know, have offspring that have them, but I do not. So
Yeah, I wonder, dangerous to what? I mean, if it's to the status quo, then maybe, because that's part of what keeps you at the forefront of trying to innovate and do something that isn't what everyone else is doing. And so, I mean, there are dangers, I suppose, in pursuing that, not just to disrupting the status quo, but to being derailed. And there are starving artists who remain starving artists for the rest of their lives, and there are others who start revolutions, and so I don't know. But it's part of, I think, what it takes to innovate, I think, is yeah, to encounter the challenges and needs of people from that one doesn't normally come into contact with. I suppose an entrepreneur would be in the same category.
true, that's right. Or a disruptor, to be sure. I mean, like, well, Hitler,
Right.
I guess let's don't go there. So.
It reminds me a bit about this connection between beauty and truth when I think of artists, and related to something that Father Bob mentioned. I recently just watched a television show that had beautiful imagery of Italy, and it was like it captivates a viewer through the beauty of the people in the show, in the landscape, but it's morally repugnant, this show. And then I think also about some philosophers, some great thinkers who write in such a dry way you can barely make it through 3 or 4 pages. And then you have some other thinkers. I mean, Nietzsche was a fantastic writer, right? Just sort of draws one in with narratives and story, and packages ideas in this way that can be very compelling. So that it seems to me like artistry and aesthetics the artist does wield a great power in that sense, right? And with that, some responsibility in terms of the way that they package certain ideas and messages that are embedded within the form of the art itself. And Matthew, in Texas, you had a question about redirecting conversations.
Well, the question is, that's why I wrote it fully, but the thing that occurs to me is more and more people have either drunk the Kool-Aid or had the soupy sauce or whatever, and the very definition of reality is becoming blurred when at Our Lady of Lebanon Maronite right here in Louisville, Texas, they had a fabulous baptism party where all the adults are the ones that are there because the 1-week-old, she's just smiling at everyone. But the reality is, what is the process for restoring the understanding that only a man and a woman can marry and have children, like John Paul wrote so compellingly in several encyclicals and other documents? How do we restore common sense, if that's the phrase that we want to say? And I'll just let others continue.
Yeah, Brandon, just in case, thank you for that question, Matthew. And the original question, Brandon, just in case you don't see it, was how do we charitably redirect conversations to a healthy, holy understanding of the human person?
Yeah, these really tough questions. Yeah. My immediate intuition is I think you have to model a morally beautiful life somehow, so that you're a witness that someone wants to listen to, I think, right? And I think that is hard. It's hard for a number of reasons. But one of the challenges also is that once the darkness starts to become really overwhelming, that even that which is objectively beautiful starts to be seen as ugly. So I don't know. I think modeling a life of charity and with a lot of kindness and revealing to people their dignity and treating them with sort of extraordinary I don't know what I would say for it's hard to win people over who are ideologically so entrenched these days in their own positions unless you can somehow disarm them, right? And beauty can be disarming, and I think moral beauty as well. If people trust you as somebody who's virtuous and who cares, who really fundamentally is committed to their good, that might be a starting point. But without that, I think all you have is people locking, closing in and locking down. I don't know if others have thoughts, but I'm not.
I have a little bit of thought on that, Brandon. It seems like, Matthew, those kind of discussions rarely rest on who has the biggest pile of facts. As if you had one more, the pile would topple over in your favor and somehow you win. I think that people's hearts are moved through kind of poetic knowledge before they're moved through syllogistic knowledge. And I think residing first and putting your efforts into kind of poetic modes of knowledge are the things that really tip people's hearts, maybe even subconsciously first. And I think that Matthew's question is it's heated, like there's no way around it. Like you don't come with no opinions about the topic. And if you try to say, well, here's a fact you hadn't thought about, there's no one in the world that's going to say, oh, I had never considered that these logical chains put together just so means that I'm going to change my whole life. So I really think it's just a kind of different tack on the kind of mode of apprehension. Just like Googling the poetic mode and sort of seeing how that works, people who have written about that, I think is probably a useful way to start thinking about it.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, is there such a thing as a beautiful conversation? You'd mentioned, Brandon, when you speak to restaurateurs, owners of cocktail bars and so forth, they'd mentioned it's often the conversation that they remember, most about a great meal or a great cocktail or something like that. We speak of people being a good conversationalist. I think there's a book called The Art of Conversation. I think in sort of high society Europe a couple hundred years ago, this was actually a skill that was cultivated to be a good conversationalist. Right? I just wonder what makes a beautiful conversation. Right? Is there an art to that? What are the elements of that? What made the conversation, in my opinion, beautiful at the dinner that we had in Georgetown?
Yeah, no, really great question. I mean, when I think of beautiful conversation, the sort of the example that comes to mind immediately is Monica and Augustine in the Confessions. It was book 10 where they're, I think it's in Ostia, and there's this really profound conversation the two of them have where they both essentially forget each other and are pulled up into something, because it is where you really have a common gaze on something else, right? And then you're no longer really self-conscious, and it's not really about you, and it's not about your agenda, but it's about something that draws you both into something higher. And I think our experience was a little bit like that. It was a bit of a transcendent experience as we were all together in this, trying to, as we were listening to each other, we were encountering who the other person is, but also learning something about what beauty is, which is this transcendental that is greater and pulling us out of ourselves.
Yeah, Father Bob, I think you had another question about beauty in the workplace.
Yeah, sure, thanks. And it's really the presence of Chris Duffel, who's a friend of mine, who's an architect, who's here in the panel, and I was just recently having a conversation with an expert educator at a local high school, who's speaking of the importance of the beauty of the physical space and the buildings in forming young people. And I wondered, Brandon, if in your work you've come across people expressing an appreciation for their own work because of the experience of beauty in the buildings where they happen to work. Certainly, the number of universities, including Catholic University of America, certainly with the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception nearby, that the experience of seeing this beauty on a daily basis is certainly adds to the presence of beauty in nature, and it's attractive and it's enticing to come to work in a place that is beautiful. In contrast, there are people, of course, who have to work in places that don't have that kind of beauty. I wonder if this came up in your study.
Yeah, absolutely. We did ask them about whether they experience beauty in their workspaces, and we have a lot of it's a status driven, right? If you're a graduate student or postdoc, you're typically working in a small cubicle, which is in a basement, which has no windows and no natural lighting, and you're there for 20 hours a day, and it's often a sort of a very demoralizing experience. They do talk about it as sort of really ugly workplaces, and science labs tend to be, in general, like, the beauty is not, whoever designs them typically doesn't think about, well, this beauty is one of the ingredients of this, so whereas professors often say, well, I've got a lovely office overlooking the pristine lawns of Yale University or whatever, right? So if you've got access to natural light and green space, are really they come up pretty often, and big windows and so forth in people's judgments of what they find beauty, and their absence is often brought up when they talk about ugliness, but also workspaces where people feel like they this sort of open office trend has also been kind of denounced by a number of people we talk to, where they're like, I don't even have the stability of knowing that I can rely on a space that I can make my own. I have to go and share this desk with a bunch of other people, and that tends to be overly, it's the kind of not knowing before you go into your workspace what that is going to look like, because you may have to be on a different desk and with a different person, etc., and noise levels you can't control, etc. All those things matter too, because it's all oriented, towards, it's not just, they're not there to appreciate the space, they're there to work. And so the aesthetics have to be conducive towards that kind of work. And if it's not, then it's a problem. But anyway, that's the sort of thing that's come up. But I mean, a sense of creating a sense of home is an odd kind of, it's an ingredient that neuroscientists who study the effect of space on us and the kinds of aesthetics of space, they talk about hominess as being really critical, no matter where you are. Even if it's a workplace, even if it's a restaurant, that sense of home seems to be a really important aesthetic principle there. And people seem to be wanting to do that, even in their scientific labs.
Making sure I didn't miss any other questions. We've got time for a couple more. I think I covered everything in the chat. Brandon, I'm really not trying to bring in Gerard into this conversation, but is there any relationship between imitation and beauty that you found?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm sure there is. I mean, I think we do, particularly in encountering moral beauty, I think we do definitely find that desire to imitate, exemplars of moral beauty. But we also imitate, other kinds of models that may not be, morally beautiful, and we regret that. So, I mean, I think I've encountered imitation only in relation to people's sense that they're either becoming more like the people they despise or becoming more like the people they aspire to. And I think workplaces have this, particularly if we're not attentive to it, right? If we're not aware of mimetic desire as a mechanism, and we're not really paying attention to what we are becoming, I think it's very easy to be inadvertently imitate just those dominant models of success, which, in the scientific workplace that I study, it's largely People who know how to step on others' necks and manage to, climb the ladder even there. It's so supervisors who don't really give credit to their students or postdocs or people who steal ideas from others, et cetera. You find a lot of that going on. And people start to say, well, I suppose that's the nature of the game. And that's kind of dangerous, so if we're not aware of how we imitate one another, and we don't have exemplars, which I'm really interested in whether academia can provide exemplars of moral beauty, because if not, I think it's going to be very problematic. But I'll be speaking in a few days to Dr. Keltner, a Berkeley psychologist who studies awe, and in particular, he looks at moral beauty as a source of awe. And I'd be curious to know, well, how do you surround yourself with moral beauty? How do you find those exemplars? So I'll let you know.
Thank you. Chris, I think we've got plenty of time for one more question.
Awesome. You had a question about how you see in your work the relationship between taste and beauty, specifically about how people are kind of in control of their own subjectivities. Let's say you understand what a kind of objective beauty is, and that people understand their own tastes. Do you see that people have a clear understanding of how these two are related and distinct? Or could you just speak to that if it needs more fleshing out? I can specify the question more.
So I mean, in the context of, I've only looked at it in the context of science, not in other workplaces, right? And so they're often it's not too hard for them to come up with sort of objective, particularly if you're like, say, a theoretical physicist or something, and you can say about, some equations are objectively beautiful because there's certain kinds of understandings of simplicity and symmetry and so on that are built into these things, and they describe reality and so forth. But they're also fads, and they're fads that these are fads are essentially tastes, and that those tastes start to become sort of endemic in a community, and then they start to direct where the money goes, and people chase the money. And so truth is very wide, and it's not just one or two equations, right? There's a lot more to truth than we can grasp. And there is a frustration that certain kinds of tastes become dominant, and then people start chasing, those fads are what drive the money. And so even certain fields of work, like, I mean, it'd be beautiful if we could solve cancer, find a cure for cancer, but there are all kinds of other medical problems that need attention. And people argue sometimes that there's a disproportionate amount of money that's directed towards cancer research, and that's siphoning money away from other areas. People have argued that string theory in physics has taken up a ton of money, and string theory is, like, in principle, some people argue untestable. Like, it's about like multiverses and so on. So people argue there that's kind of bad for science. It's kind of it may not be untrue, but it certainly has to do with taste and with fads driving an agenda.
Yeah.
Dennis, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay. Do you hear me okay?
Yeah.
We can. Yeah.
Okay. I'm sitting in a cafe of, I guess, moderate beauty. And this is interesting. And I'll love to talk to you more, Brandon. Thanks for everything. I didn't catch the beginning, but the remark about Girard and others had me thinking of a juxtaposition between sort of tradition, modernity, and postmodernity, which Girard was for Thomas Saint Rene was central in introducing sort of postmodern, post-structural thinking in America. And then I think it took off here in a really wacky direction, frankly. And so then it's blamed for much of the deterioration that some of the commenters have spoken to. How do we orient back toward eternal truth, toward a genuine conversation, understanding what a family truly is, and so on. And so in that context, I was hearing you saying, Brandon, in part resonates with to me that there's something to be salvaged and important out of some of the postmodern work of a reorientation toward the particularity of each person, the importance of narrative of the story, and beauty in small things, that one can use constructively as a way to rediscover traditional truth and beauty, and in the workplace and every day. Just coming back from a year in France, and you know how there's so much emphasis on detail, particular elegance in small things, and you know there's something to be learned for that. So I was wondering if you see something promising there or salvageable. And kind of a postmodern critique, is there you know, nonetheless something that helps us orient toward beauty?
Oh, that's a good question.
Sorry.
I'm starting to think about how it would connect to the work I've done. I can't immediately see something with Luke if anything jumps to your mind.
Yeah, maybe because I'm too absorbed in a project like that. But when yeah, thinking of how you find beauty in small things, I think for it's easy to get caught up in sort of the you know the universality of particular truths and certainties and also our modern universality of architecture and everything else, and lose sight of how the individual person has been experiencing that. And what I hear you saying is actually, you know, in the science lab or whatever, reorienting toward appreciating the everyday experience of persons and how that can reconnect with beauty in order to, you know, increase the meaning and satisfaction of what they do.
Yeah, which is, I mean, it's part of why I don't impose any kind of definition of beauty when I do this work. I mean, I really want to know what it means to people, and whether if there are sort of objective criteria, do they, you know, are they things that are recognized, right? So leaving it open to people to you know, and beauty is an odd word, and often people are like, oh, I've never thought about it before. There's something I think helpful. At this stage, I'm really just sort of inductively trying to assemble stories and experiences. I do find a lot of common threads, right? I think once you start to show it to people, they can say, all right, clearly there's something here that's more than just idiosyncratic. But I think valuing personal experience seems to be a good place to start.
Thanks, Brandon, and thanks for the question, Dennis. We need to wrap up. I as you were speaking, it does seem like focusing, and I think art has an important role to play on the ordinary and beauty in the ordinary and in the particularities of each person. You know, I think of an art exhibit that I saw as one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, where a father had taken a picture of his son's face every day for 20 years or something like that. And you know, you see this person sort of growing up. I think of a film like Patterson, which on the surface is not about. I mean, it's about a relationship between a husband and a wife, and it's very beautiful. And it's sort of what seems to me a way to sort of break out of the mimetic striving for novelty and to just focus on, you know, the particularity of the human experience. And I think that might be one way out of
That's
some
great
of
film, by the way. I second the film endorsement.
It's a great film, and also I'll make a book endorsement as well, because Brandon, at one point on the call, you mentioned beauty can be disarming, and Disarming Beauty is one of the best books by a Catholic writer that I've read in the last 5 or 10 years. So I highly recommend that, by Julian Caron, Disarming Beauty. So we got a film and a book recommendation out of this.
Well, it's sort of add one more little point on that, which is there's also the beauty of asymmetry and the beauty of brokenness and the beauty of incompleteness and imperfection, which I think is all, you know, tied into this too, right? I think our fixation on perfection, I think, has been problematic in many ways. So.
Well, thank you so much for being with us, Brandon.
Hey,
this is a wonderful discussion. Thanks everybody for being here. I would love to keep going on, but I hope to see you all back here next month. We don't have the date or the guest locked down quite yet for next month, but we will email you as soon as we do. You should receive a survey to give us feedback on this if you signed up through Eventbrite, so please be on the lookout for that. And we will hopefully see you all next month, and I wish you all a very Merry Christmas. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Luke.
Thank you.
Yep.